two ladies and a man.
Welcome back, everybody. We have swapped microphones. We hope that will further help. And just before we get going, there is a question from the last session which appeared on the chat from those at home.
Oh, well done.
And so I picked that up, and the question is, did R S Thomas have a good singing voice? And was he interested in music?
I don't know the answer to the first one. I have no record that he ever sang. I'm a bit surprised, actually. But yeah, no, he did have a knowledge of music. In fact, it's quite surprising range. I was looking only yesterday, there's a long interview done in Welsh on Radio Cymru some years ago, and interspersed with it, it's like this on disc sort of thing. And one of the things, some people here will know it, that wonderful recording from the Moscow Metropolitan Church of Creed by a Russian composer. And that's not the sort of thing you might have expected. And it is wonderful. But he knows it. He knows a surprising amount of... He did have records. So, yeah, music, but I think not singing.
Liked a bit of music, but maybe didn't sing a lot.
No.
And just while we're waiting for one or two to join us, our trivia fact for today, we may know this, that on the New English Bible, which Tony referenced earlier that R S Thomas wasn't too keen on, both C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot worked on that. There we go. Just thought I'd put that in. In fact, they were on the same committee for one of the texts. Okay, without further ado, I shall put the microphone here,
okay,
and hope it will pick up well.
Yeah. If anybody at any point is not picking up what I'm saying, and you actually do want to pick up what I'm saying, just stick your, I do tend to drop my voice, particularly when there's a mic. So if it's not working, just wave. Yeah, please do. Yeah. And can I just have a little advert break while we're waiting? I will put out some copies at lunchtime of a book of R S Thomas poetry, which I co-edited with my colleague at Languages and Walter Davis. It's called Too Brave to Dream, and it is a collection. After he died, we acquired his what was left of his library at Bangor, and amongst those were two books on modernist painting by Herbert Reed from the 1930s. They were undoubtedly Elsie's. The wife was an artist and taught art. And interleaved in these two books were some manuscript poems. They were what the theorists call ekphrastic poems, which simply means poems to paintings. Anyway, these were unpublished, and any good jobbing academic is going to say, let's get these in. They're good, I think they're interesting. And so Blood Axe Books were very keen, and I've got some copies there. They did a lovely job, and I've forgotten what the cover price is, but they're yours for £5 each at the interval, whatever. All funds will go to the running of the centre. So, end of the advert break. Okay. Are we ready to go? I've lost. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. We're moving on from New Wales and Iago and his fellows. In 1967, so I've already mentioned, I think, R S Thomas left the parish of Eglwysfar, where the military chaps were, and became vicar at St Hohen's Church at Aberdaron, a far tip of the Llŷn Peninsula. I'm really surprised there's a number of people here who've been to Aberdaron and share my love of the place. The church, originally built in the Norman period, is, as I said before, almost on the beach. And at high tide, when we're there, the church is filled with the sound of the sea, which is wonderful. We can't go any further west. In fact, RS had been familiar with the place before 67. He was an avid bird watcher, as some of you will know. A serious bird watcher. His life list is enormous. And he'd come to Aberdaron with his close friend Bill Condry, the naturalist. Again, some of you may know Bill Condry's naturalist writing. He used to write the nature notes for The Guardian. And he and Bill used to watch the flocks of migratory birds. He and Bill, RS won a literary award. And you're supposed to spend the money on, from the Welsh Arts Council, you're supposed to spend the money on furthering your career. Well, he spent it on a trip to Spain with Bill to go bird watching. And they're at one, it's a wonderful story, they're at one point somewhere in Spain and they're there with their binoculars. And what they're not aware of is that this is a military base. And the Spanish police arrive. Bill, very funny about this. And of course they're in trouble and Bill's doing this show. He turns around and RS is still there with his glasses. There we are. So he was a bird watcher, and that's what first took him to Aberdaron. He wasn't, as I say, sorry to leave Eglwysfarch. He'd hoped to find a parish which was more Welsh-speaking than Avon. But as I said, the dominant group in his congregation were not only English-speaking, but this retired colonial government class and retired military folk. There are many books of RS's I recommend, but for those who are into The Echoes Return Slow, which is an autobiography in, I was going to say it's an autobiography in verse. There are poems and there are very finely drawn pieces of prose on the opposite page, and it takes you through his life. Some of it's a bit enigmatic, some of it's marvellous, but here he is. When the English colonised a parish, a vicar's is chaplain's work, officers' mess, receptions, and relations were, as I say, not good. Their conception of God for him was just too limited. God was a being whom one could address directly. A congregation at prayer, he writes, telling him what he's like. God, the feeling comes through. He called them our Heavenly Father gang. Relations were not good. This was very different, obviously, to the notions of God, which R.S. is already exploring in his poetry in the 60s and 70s. He said in an interview in the 1980s, I was very conscious it wasn't my duty in the church, in the pulpit, to expand my own views, because I was there to present the gospel. And the particular church of which I was a member, the Anglican Church, I kept to the prayer book and to its teachings as far as I could. Thomas himself, as I've already said, had profound reservations about contemporary visions, the prayer book and the New English Bible. The result was a growing sense of his own inauthenticity, I think, as a priest. He's preaching one thing, but not entirely signed up to that notion of God. And uxorious valour, so fond of discretion as to defer to it as his better half, voyeur of truth because of an ability to lie sideways, lie in both senses. He's a great punster. There's a wonderful essay by Damon Walford Davis, Jason's brother, about R.S., just called R S Thomas Punster. We'll see one or two of them a bit later, but not a jokey pun, but a word that has more than one meaning and kind of can resonate with meaning like a lie. The move from Eglwysfarch inevitably brought a change in Thomas's imaginative concerns and thus in his poetry. He commented in a TV programme about him in the 1990s, and I quote, I made some sort of break in my poetry coming to Aberdaron. I had a sort of feeling that I'd more or less said what I wanted to say about the farmers and the Welsh hill country and the Welsh problem. And as the very marked character of the Llŷn Peninsula began to impinge on me, I became conscious of the sea all around me, geological time, the Precambrian rocks, and I began to walk in a slightly different direction. This is not to say, of course, that he abandoned the Welsh problem, as he called it, the threat to cultural identity. These issues, though, he now addressed in prose, in polemical essays, very often in Welsh, addressed to the Welsh people themselves, urging them to be true to their language and their culture. It didn't always go down well. I mean, Welsh nationalists are a bit edgy, or were a bit edgy about RS. He's an incomer, in a sense, to the culture. And in many ways, and I argued about this in my little book, the sense of himself, the awareness of himself as somehow an outsider to everything, an outsider to Wales, an outsider to true belief, and still some of that in a second. Thomas's first collection, to be published after the move to Aberdaron in 1967, was strikingly different to his previous work. It was called H apostrophe N. It's a wonderful title, isn't it? You know, there is a pun there. Published in 1972. And in that book, an anthropomorphized God is confronted by the machine, often with a capital M. The style is almost cartoon-like at times, and as several commentators have pointed out, at times, stylistically, it echoes Ted Hughes's Crow poems, if you know them. That's poems again from the 60s. They were being published alongside Thomas in some of the poetic journals. So Thomas, well, he knew Hughes, but he knew the poems. But whereas Hughes's Crow represents a sort of rampant, seemingly indestructible natural energy to which Hughes's version of God has no answer. The machine in Thomas's collection is the incarnation of the non-spiritual, anti-imaginative impulses which we saw earlier, mechanical and life-denying. God is at times in these poems a querulous old man, incapable of defeating the forces of the machine. Thus in Other, which is the first one on the sheet, it was perfect. He could do nothing about it. Its waters were as clear as his own eye. The grass was his breath. The mystery of the dark earth was what went on in himself. This is God. The machine appeared in the distance, singing to itself of money. Its song was the web they were caught in, men and women together. The villages were as flies to be sucked empty. God secreted a tear. Enough, enough, he commanded. But the machine looked at him and went on singing. You can see what I mean, this sort of cartoon-like quality about it. It's very, very different to what had come earlier. Or in the same collection, God is spiteful, an arbitrary and illogical tyrant. God said, I will build a church here, cause this people to worship me, and afflict them with poverty and sickness in return for centuries of hard work and patience. So what we clearly have here, I think, is a parody of human constructions of God. This is God as constructed by human beings. A being created by mankind in its image. The God, dare we say it, almost of our Heavenly Father gang, or one of the gods, or one of the versions of God. In once, the speaker seems to be Adam meeting his Eve, though this seems to be not the Adam of Genesis, but of some kind of recreation after some kind of catastrophe. Is it a nuclear war or what? That's kind of apocalyptic experience is present in. This certainly isn't Eden It's more some sort of wasteland, as I said earlier, and its poem is echoed a couple of times in the collection. Here is on the sheet. God looked at space, and I appeared, rubbing my eyes at what I saw. And I'm taking the big A to be this version of Adam. God looked at space, and I appeared, rubbing my eyes at what I saw. The earth smoked, no birds sang. And in the late morning, you, I take this to be Eve, you rising towards me out of the depths of myself. I took your hand, remembering you, and together, confederates of the natural day, we went forth to meet the machine. Again, it's a bleak lawyer. At other points, the machine world is portrayed as some kind of grotesque Vanity Fair. This is the last poem in the collection. The idiot goes round and around with his brother in a bumping car at a fair. The famous idiot smile hangs over the car's edge, illuminating nothing. This is mankind being taken for a ride by a rich relation. The responses are fixed. Bump, smile, and the current is generated by the smooth flow of the shillings. This is an orchestra of steel with a constant percussion of laughter. But where he should be laughing too, his features, that's the idiot, his features are split open, and look, out of the cracks come warm human tears, like that one human sound we saw earlier. The one human sound was the lament of the poets. And we notice again the pun, taken for a ride, in both its senses. And that word smooth. Smooth becomes a pejorative in this period. Smooth really needs to be hedged around with question marks. He talks in the poem about technology, the smoothness, that smooth sound that is technology's purring. Yeah. So as R.S. moves to Aberdaron, there is a change in the poetry, but he's still wrestling with the problematic nature of the relation between God and humanity. The move to the new landscape of the Llyn may initially have been an escape from the pressures of Eglwysfarth and the parish there, but it brought its own challenges. In his autobiography, Thomas writes of how this area had religious connections with the Celtic period, and of course Bardsey Island is right there. And then he comments, and typically Neb, which is his autobiography, is written in Welsh, so he's writing to home, as it were. Neb means nobody in Welsh, and it's written in the third person. I mean, psychologists have had quite a good time with this particular book. Here he is. Gazing on the pre-Cambrian rocks on Reicher Port, R.S. realised that he was in contact with something that had been there for 1,000 million years. His head would spin. On seeing his shadow fall on such ancient rocks, he had to question himself in a different context and ask the same old question as before. Who am I? The answer now came more emphatically as before. No one. It's a strange and, I think, revealing moment. As I said, the Welsh language autobiography in which the passage is translated, it's published in 85, is in fact entitled Nobody. There. Now, again, one needs to be careful not to slide into the field of psychology rather than literature. But R.S. does seem to show on a number of occasions, what we might see as an insecure sense of personal identity. He not only calls his autobiography Neb, but writes about himself in the third person. It's a curious sort of distancing himself from his own experience. The theme of what we might call insecure identity appears in a number of places in his various autobiographical writing. He tells of how at university in the 1930s he overhears someone saying about him, "Who does he think he is?" And he comments, in retrospect, of us looking back, he didn't know who he was. He was no one. So why this sense of insecurity should be, why this should be there, is, as I say, material for the psychologist, not the literary critic. One might point to the way in which he essentially remakes himself as a Welshman, seeks to live finally in another language, Welsh. But of course, I should perhaps say here, he was pretty fluent in Welsh. So then you ask the question, well, if he's so nationalistic, why is he writing in English? And this question has been asked over and over again. And he gives the answer, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable answer. He didn't start to learn Welsh until he was into his late 20s, 30s. Writing poetry in a second language, and particularly when you've learned as an adult, is pretty problematic. I can't, well, maybe somebody can hear that, I can't think of a major poet who's writing in a second language. You need that intuitive knowledge of resonance, of meaning. Why that word, not that word, that I think only a native speaker has. He actually says that this left a scar on him. He uses the word craith, a scar, that he can't do what he most intimately wants to do, write poetry in the language that is, closest to his heart in some ways, Welsh. So these issues are there too. In a sense, as I said, I think he always felt himself something of an outsider. Certainly not English, but not somehow authentically Welsh, not a native Welsh speaker. At one point in The Echoes Return Slow, he writes, "There was a hope he was outside of, with no one to ask him in." I find that deeply moving. There was a hope he was outside of, with no one to ask him in. And I want to argue, I think, that part of his search for God is for a spiritual reality in which he could feel at home and know who he was. That word home I want to come back to. It's a crucial one. In some ways, this is a bit flip, but in some ways, I think the poetry is a search for home, or a home, wherever he could find that. Let's look at this search from another angle. He's always associated, obviously, with the Welsh countryside, especially the hill farms in mid-Wales. But that's to miss out on an interesting and important element in R.S.'s imaginative world. He was brought up in Holyhead, in sight and sound of the Irish Sea. He played as a boy on the seasides of Anglesey. In a passage celebrating the freedom of his boyhood on the shores of Anglesey, he writes, this is in another Welsh autobiographical essay called Dylanwadau, Influences, my translation. "I was a boy with the energy of a young colt, and would race the wind and sing out in front of the waves, trying to catch the salt snowflakes as they rose off the sea." I thought it's Wordsworthian, isn't it? Except it's the sea. His father, who was always something of a hero to R.S., had been a merchant seaman who'd actually sailed the world's oceans until settling with his wife and son in Holyhead after the First World War. And he worked on the ferries between Wales and Ireland. But as I say, it's referred to in a number of the poems, little stories about seamen under sail, and it's the father. There's a poem, Salt, which is about the father. R S himself refers to his own, quote, terrible longing for the sea when he was a curate at Chirk, a long way away from the sea. And there's a sense in which the sea never leaves his creative imagination. This is an odd thing, but you see it everywhere once you've spotted it. When he's writing about the hill farmers of mid Wales, here he is, for example, describing a farm labourer. There he goes, tacking against the fields, uneasy tides, while the noisy surf of people dins far off at the world's rim. But he's there in mid Wales on the moorland, but what he's writing about at some level is drawing on metaphors of the sea. Another labourer wades in the blue bilge of earth hour by hour. He asks Iago Pryder, do you remember the shoals of wheat, the look of the prawned barley, or the music of the torn scythe breaking in regular waves over the lithe limbs of the grass? And of course at Aberdaron the sea was ever present. You can hear it in the church, as I said. In the later poetry then, the sea becomes the dynamic embodiment of the natural universe, which is both beautiful and also potentially violent, even predatory. So again, he writes in there, the autobiography. It's on the sheet. There are two aspects to the sea, the external and the internal. Or, if you wish, it is both a mirror and a window. In the mirror is to be seen all the beauty and glory of the creation, the colours and the shapes of the clouds with the birds going by on their eternal journey. But I'm using it as a window. An endless war is to be seen, one creature mercilessly and continuously devouring another. Under the deceptively innocent surface, there are thousands of horrors, as if they were the Creator's failed experiments. And through the seaweed, as if through a forest, the seals and the cormorants and the mackerel hunt like voracious wolves. What kind of God created such a world? A God of love? Really? He asks the awkward questions. He asks the awkward questions of himself. If the complexity of the natural universe, its pitilessness, its beauty, I'm quoting a poem called Island Men, about seamen, the determined struggle against the sea for survival becomes an image of the necessary resilience of the Christian believer, struggling to stay afloat, to maintain his or her faith in a supposedly loving God when there's an awful lot of evidence around that that's a problematic idea. In Farming Peter, published in 1975, but reminiscent of the, so I'm just making sure, yes, it's on the sheet. Farming Peter, published in 75, but reminiscent of the poems of the Welsh Hill Country earlier, the farmer walking the brown breakers of his ploughed land. See, R S is watching this ploughed field, but he sees waves. It's just part of his makeup. The farmer walking the ploughed land remains true to his own way of life, his own vision. And the poet links the man's determined faith with that of Simon Peter in St. Matthew, struggling to walk on the surface of the Sea of Galilee, struggling to respond with faith to Christ's call. The man went at his call with the fathoms under him. And because of his faith in the creation of his own hands, he was buoyed up, floundering, but never sinking. And then in synopsis, This image of the lonely figure striving to stay afloat over the fathoms under him is connected to an author whose writing is often echoed in R S Thomas's later poetry. In a hostile world seemingly stripped of certainty, even of identity, lacking any assurance of a divine order, the self we are left with is, and I quote, that grey subject of dread that Søren Kierkegaard depicted crossing its thousands of fathoms. For Kierkegaard, authentic existence, authentic identity, is derived only from faith born of constant and strenuous spiritual struggle with doubt. In a universe where nothing is certain, it's a very modern, very bleak vision. Walter Lowry, Kierkegaard's translator and editor, expresses it thus, it's on the sheet. The Christian has to renounce the comfort of calm assurance bolstered upon objective proofs, and must be content with a fighting certainty. Perhaps I should say a fighting certainty. He, the male pronoun is Lowry's, he constantly lies over a depth of 70,000 fathoms. Here, the search for God involves a confrontation with anxiety and fear. Fear that the universe in fact is empty, and indeed a loss of self. But individual faith, by definition, can't rest in the safety of supposedly objective proofs. If you have proof, you don't need faith. Yeah? Here's Kierkegaard on the sheet. I contemplate the order of nature in the hope of finding God, and I see omnipotence and wisdom. But I also see much else that disturbs my mind and excites anxiety. The sum of all this is an objective uncertainty. But without risk, there is no faith. Faith is precisely the contradiction between the infinite passion of the individual's inwardness and the objective, outside, uncertainty. If I'm capable of grasping God objectively, I do not believe, but precisely because I cannot do this, I must believe, that is, have faith. If I wish to preserve myself in faith, I must constantly be intent upon holding fast the objective uncertainty so as to remain out upon the deep over 70,000 fathoms of water, still preserving my faith. R S keeps coming back to Kierkegaard in this period in the early 70s, primarily. He has Kierkegaard was still on his shelf, and we got those books from the cottage. Objective thought, using his phrase, based upon some sort of shared, logically or scientifically arrived at proof, denies authentic selfhood for Kierkegaard. Objective thought translates everything into results, and as is Kierkegaard in concluding scientific postscript. Objective thought translates everything into results and helps all mankind to cheat by copying these off and reciting them by rote. It's inauthentic. In a way, this is perhaps another manifestation, isn't it, of the world of the machine. That is, of logic and technology, and that's the world that otherwise wants nothing to do with. The individual is tempted to escape from the stress of imaginative and spiritual striving into the safety of the certain and the proven, and though in doing so surrenders his or her selfhood, becomes less, for Kierkegaard and for Thomas, less than fully and authentically alive. In an interview in 1983, Thomas actually directly commented, concluding unscientific postscript, every few years it does one good to tackle it, I suppose. You know. Clearly, RS had been tackling Kierkegaard's concluding unscientific postscript in the late 70s and early 80s, so that in strands, which is on the sheet. It was never easy. There was a part of us, training uterine memories, would have lapsed back into Eden, the mindless place. The alternative, though, thought Thomas, is to have to confront the abyss of anxiety and uncertainty. Must we draw back? Is there a far side to an abyss? And can our wings take us there? Or is man's meaning in the keeping of himself afloat over 70,000 fathoms, tacking against winds coming from no direction, going in no direction? But it is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, the fathoms images from Kierkegaard, but Thomas's fascination with the sea, his roots in the sea, give him this imaginative richness of playing with the image. And so in the poem, it's next on the sheet, Ballads, the protagonist is again in Kierkegaard's fear-filled universe. But the opening image clearly is the story of the pirates making somebody walk the plank. You know, no piracy, but there is a plank to walk over 70,000 fathoms, as Kierkegaard would say, and far out from the land. I have abandoned my theories, the easier certainties of belief. There are no handrails to grasp. I stand, and on either side there is the haggard gallery of the dead, those who in their day walked here and fell. Above and beyond, there is the galaxy's violence, the meaningless waste of force. Is there a place here for the spirit? Is there time on this brief platform for anything other than mind's failure to explain itself? I find this an extraordinary poem, actually, movingly personal but resonant. It's a dizzying evocation of a profound sense of insecurity and vulnerability. No handrails, this brief platform. You can see it, I think, you can feel it. And again, isolation in a vast, indifferent universe. The star-filled skies above Aberdaron, dark landscape, have been transmuted into a whole new register of dread. Amongst the books from RS's library, which are now in our archive, is his copy of Pascal's Pensées. Now, he was not a great annotator. There are books which we know he read. You can see they've been read, and he doesn't put anything in there. Other times there is annotation in the margins, and that's gold, you know. At some point, was it in this period that I'm speaking about? I think it was. When Thomas read Pascal's words, the eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. The translation in the Everyman edition that he's reading will not do. And RS crosses out frightens and writes appalls. You know, it's not strong enough. And when I just realised he uses the same word in Evans, the darkness appalled him, because there he's playing with appalled, pallor, the going pale. That's what Paul means. Sorry, moving away from the microphone, that's the issue. And it's against the darkness, but there's the same word. Crosses it out, it's absolutely clear. Now what's going on? Poems like ballads appear to indicate some sort of, I think, particularly acute spiritual and emotional crisis. Most of the poems I've been talking about in the last few minutes were published in Frequencies in 1978, or were published in the early 80s. Now, in 1978, Thomas retired from the priesthood. I said he did offer to go on, but his offer was not picked up. But as I say, no new incumbent was approached, but he's out of a job. He writes to his friend in this period, the Welsh poet and critic Raymond Garlick, "I'm glad to go from the church I no longer believe in. Sycophantic to the Queen, iconoclastic with language, changing for the sake of change, and regardless of beauty." So, there's real anguish here in all sorts of ways. And so R.S. and Elsie moved to a small cottage, what he's peering out of here, at Saint-Rue, just a few miles away, which they'd already been renting for some years. In fact, when R.S. looks back at his retirement some years later in The Echoes Return Slow, there's an almost palpable sigh of release at his escape from the routines of congregational worship. Worship which for his congregation, and it's an unsophisticated congregation, of course, at Eglisfark and Aberdaron, presupposes a notion of God as an anthropomorphic being who listens carefully to intercessory prayer. This is R.S. in The Echoes Return Slow. The pretenses are done with. The eavesdropper at the door is a fiction. The well-bred amens to the formal orisons have begun to fade. So at one level, he's well out of it. He did, I think, there's that gap I've already mentioned between what he felt he had to preach in the pulpit, simple little sermons, and what he was exploring in his own study. And again, for a man who for years had a very regular routine, he studied and read and wrote in the mornings, he walked and made parish visits in the afternoon and the early evening, and of course there were the regular services. So he was a man of routine in many ways. His son says this. And especially a man who, as we've seen, shows signs of an insecure sense of identity. Well, he'd been a priest for almost 50 years. But now, as he leaves the priesthood, who is he? What is he? What is his role? What's he going to do? We could perhaps say in some ways, this is my line, the pastor becomes the lone pilgrim. His whole nature changes in that, his whole position in relation to the spiritual changes. At one level he's relieved, he's no longer in the pulpit, but at another level we get that vision that we get in Balance of, I don't know what you call it, profound anxiety, disorientation is perhaps a better word. Looking back some 10 years later, the stress of the period is still vividly recalled. This is in Echoes Return Slow, one of the prose passages. The problems he had concealed from his congregation had him now all to himself. A man who had refrained from quarrelling with his parishioners for fear of rhetoric, over what poetry could he be said to preside from his quarrel with himself? He's referring to Yeats, of course, who says, we make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but out of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry. And obviously the poetry we're not looking at comes out of that quarrel, out of that uncertainty. That this is a period of acute stress is evident in the poetry, but the depth of his crisis is perhaps evident in another letter he wrote in the 80s to Raymond Garlick. Garlick he was a Roman Catholic. He lost his faith. His marriage had broken down. He's undergoing a great period of stress. And R.S. recalls, how 10 years earlier, which would take us to this period in the 70s, feeling more and more on edge, until suddenly, one night, something snapped. He then suggests to Garlic that it's because he'd been on a vegetarian diet. Doesn't wash at all. But one wonders at the coincidence of the dates. The doctor, in fact, put him on Valium. You know, Elsie's diary records this, and there are bouts later. Again, I don't really want to pseudo-psychologise, but I'm trying to join things up, the life and the poetry. Let's not speculate too much about the life. Let's stick to the poems. What we have in the poetry of this period in the 70s and early 80s are images of solitary pilgrimage across a dark landscape of unscalable cliffs and terrifying abysses, in which the lonely protagonist reaches out longingly, uncertainly, to a God who, assuming he exists, or it exists, I'll come back to that, cannot be reached. So thus, in thresholds on the sheet, what balance, that word again, what balance is needed at the edges of such an abyss? I'm alone on the surface of a turning planet. What to do? But like Michelangelo's Adam, put my hand out into unknown space, hoping for the reciprocal touch. The allusion, of course, is to the creation of Adam, that image on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where Adam reaches out to God, who in turn is reaching down to him, their fingers almost touching. But tellingly, threshold, this poem, is the last poem in the book. It's faced by the blank page of the end paper, reaching out to the reciprocating touch, blank page. It's not an accident. He's very careful about where he put the poem. Waiting, published in Frequencies in 78, seems to me to be in many ways a key poem in that it engages many of the issues with which he wrestles in the later poetry. Thomas. Face to face are no God. Look at that on Jean de Mont, again, that carrying on. You think, face to face are no. And then you drop your eye down, and that's not what he's saying. Not quite, although it's rather different. Face to face are no God. Such language falsifies the relation. Nor side by side, nor near you, nor anywhere in time and space. Young, I pronounced you, God. Older, I still do, but seldomer now, leaning far out over an immense depth, letting your name go and waiting somewhere between faith and doubt for the echoes of its arrival. The reference at the opening, of course, is to Jacob's wrestling with God in Genesis 32, seeking to know his name. Finally, Jacob names the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face. R S Thomas's God is more elusive. The poet, again, can only wait or reach out over that immense depth. How does one then communicate with this elusive, ambiguous God? And indeed, what is the nature of this God? Is God indeed a being whom one can love? Well, he was asked this question by an interviewer. There's a remarkable piece. There are lots of newspaper pieces. They trailed down dutifully from London, oh good heavens, down to West Wales to interview this baleful priest. But there's a piece in the Daily Telegraph in 1999, which is marvellous, called A Poet Who Sang Creation. And he's asked some really quite shrewd question about, is God a being whom one can love? I've been influenced much, he said, by the American poet Robinson Jeffers. You never know who he's been reading. You see, he knows a lot about American poetry, which is quite, unexpected. Wallace Stevens, I've written about this. Wallace Stevens is an important influence on I use the word influence. He's been published in a magazine called Critical Quarterly, an academic journal, which also published poetry, which was co-edited from Bangor at one stage in the 60s. And so he's reading American poetry. He's being published alongside Sylvia Plath, which is a bit striking. Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes and R S Thomas, there they are. There was a story which somebody told me, that Plath and Hughes came to Bangor. These Critical Quarterly used to have these sort of summer schools, conferences. And one of them was in Bangor because Tony Dyson was one of the editors. And the person was making a bit of a joke because he said that Sylvia Plath used to go out and collect mushrooms, do her rural thing. Ted Hughes just stay in bed, And I said, well, hang on, was R S Thomas there? In other words, did he meet Sylvia Plath, which is, I knew about the poetry. And I couldn't prove it. He was at the next conference in London. I didn't even, it's an hour, less than an hour. And so I met somebody else who was there. Yeah, sure enough, R.S. was there. So he met Sylvia Plath. But it's such a mind-boggling, Anyway, here we are. I've been much influenced by the American poet Robinson Jeffers, who says somewhere, the people who talk of God in human terms think of that. No, loving God is too much of a human construct. What there must be is awe. I feel much more at home with Wordsworth's vision of Snowdon in the Prelude, where he says, it seemed to me the type of a majestic intelligence, the emblem of a mind that feeds upon infinity. That's Wordsworth. The type of a majestic intelligence, the emblem of a mind that feeds upon infinity. And the passage he's referring to, that R.S. is referring to, is in book 14 of The Prelude, Wordsworth's great epic autobiography. Now, did I put this on the sheet? Yes, it is on the sheet. When into air had partially dissolved that vision, in calm thought reflected, it appeared to me the type of a majestic intellect, its acts and its possessions, what it has and craves, what in itself it is and would become. There I beheld the emblem of a mind that feeds upon infinity, that broods over the dark abyss, intent to hear its voices issuing forth to silent light in one continuous stream. It's a bit hard words, but it's Wordsworth having it's almost a mystical moment on the hillside and encountering what one might call God in other, but he doesn't call it this. He's got this majestic intellect, this whatever it is, this presence. As I say, it's almost a mystical moment, certainly a moment of profound awareness. And it's such moments in the natural world, of course, which for Wordsworth and Coleridge stimulate the imagination. And they don't, of course, mean imagination in the sense of that which constructs something fictional. As R.S. makes it clear in an interview in 72, he, like them, uses the word to indicate the imagination is something that gives insight into, awareness of, that which transcends the material, reaches beyond the merely rational. It's the imagination that gives you access to the spiritual. He talks in an interview in 72, imagination, he's saying, I'm using the word imagination in its Coleridgean sense, the highest means known to the human psyche of getting into contact with the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is what we call God. The passage in which the awestruck Wordsworth senses some mysterious presence beyond the finite world seems to have had particular meaning for R.S. He'd included it 10 years earlier in his, he edited the Penguin Book of Religious Verse. And if you're into RS, get hold of a second-hand copy of the Penguin Book of Religious Verse. It's fascinating what he chooses in there. And he refers to it again in an interview to mark his 70th birthday, when he's again seeking to explain his understanding of the nature of God. He then relates this same passage on Wordsworth to more recent theological thinking. It's on the sheet. I do like Tillich's idea of the ground of being, that God is not a being. I rather suspect that so many Christians, we've been brought up on the Bible to believe that God is a being, whereas the slightly more impersonal approach of Hindu thought, and Buddhistic thought for that matter, does give me the feeling that this is more what I am after. If there is any contact with an eternal reality, I don't want to limit that reality to personality. It's a bit like Wordsworth's 14th book on the Prelude. It seems to me a type of majestic intellect. This seems to me more what I am after. References to his sympathy for Hindu and Buddhistic thinking recur in R.S.'s writing and interviews. And I said that he'd written for this Theosophical journal from early on, so it stays. It's really interesting. More work to be done there. But let's stick with Tillich. As I pointed out elsewhere, the 3 volumes of Paul Tillich's systematic theology were again on R S Thomas's shelves when he died. They're in Dangenau. The first 2, the third one was given to him late in life by an American friend. The first 2 are the important ones because, again, they're annotated by Thomas, albeit the annotation is, as usual, pretty sparse. But he has firmly marked one passage with a line down the margin. However, this is the passage. If the notion of God appears in systematic theology in correlation with the threat of non-being, which is implied in existence, you can have existence, you can have non-existence, God must be called the infinite power of being, which resists the threat of non-being. In classical theology, this is being itself. If anxiety is defined as the awareness of being finite, being on your own, being limited, God must be called the infinite ground of courage. In other words, for Tillich, God is not a being, but being itself. A notion of ultimate reality, which R.S. echoes in a poem entitled Temptation, published posthumously in the book Residues. The date is unclear, but it's almost certainly after 1995. This is a late poem. He dies in 2000. It's on the sheet. But something, so that I can neither see nor hear, only apprehend it. Not a being either, but being. That atmosphere which, when I kneel down, I breathe like an oxygen of the spirit. Isn't that marvellous, isn't it? Now this takes us a significant step along the way as to how to access being itself. We remember that poem we looked at a few minutes ago, Waiting. Letting your name go and waiting somewhere between faith and doubt for the echoes of its arrival. That stance of waiting is, I think, key to R.S. In his essay, Silence and the Poet, the critic George Steiner points out that, quote, a recurrent trope in Western literature from medieval Latin to Cimber's verse is that of, in Steiner's words, the necessary limitations of the human word. Here we are. This is, R.S. can sign up to this. Something is lost. Remember in that other poem. When I speak, something is lost of God. It is decisively the fact that language does have its frontiers, says Steiner. which gives proof of a transcendent presence in the fabric of the world. It is just because we can go no further, because speech so marvellously fails us, that we experience the certitude of a divine meaning surpassing and enfolding ours. What lies beyond man's word is eloquent of God, ultimate reality. Having made this connection, having made a connection between Steiner's essay and R.S.'s poetry quite discreetly, some years ago, I have to say, I really was intrigued. I was so pleased when R.S.'s books arrived in our centre to find Language and Silence. Indeed, he had read Steiner. I rather hope you read my essay too, but I've no confidence in that one. Clearly, if language is inadequate, if ultimate reality transcends the capacities of our language, silence would seem to be a more appropriate way, perhaps the only mode of approach to a God, a reality, who is, to quote R.S.'s poem Via Negativa, the great absence in our lives, the empty silence within. The posture of the believer must be changed, it seems, from active seeker or wrestler to a less assertive stance. We must change our mood to the passive, he writes in a poem called Adjustments. I would want to suggest that the stance we're really talking about is less passivity per se than what Wordsworth again calls in Lyrical Ballads wise passiveness, a mode of silent attentiveness, of silent waiting. In other words, not just being passive, it's being alert, it's being alive and waiting. This isn't on the sheet, but I'll read it. It's called Shadows. I close my eyes. The darkness implies your presence. The shadow of your steep mind on my world. I shiver in it. And so I listen instead and hear the language of silence. Prayer is no longer then an effort to obtain whatever is needed. It has no object anymore. In Echoes to Return Slow, he writes, you have to imagine a waiting that is not impatient. Rather, is it a state of mind, a kind of receptive alignment, as I said earlier, with the spiritual. Again, I'm not qualified to speak, but I'm reminded of R.S.'s interest in Eastern religion. It seems to me, and I have no expertise, to be not a million miles away from some aspects of Zen. R.S. wrote a second poem entitled Waiting in the early 1980s, but here an altogether rather calmer state of mind has been achieved. This is again on the sheet. Now, in the small hours of belief, the one eloquence to master is that of the bowed head, the bent knee, waiting, as at the end of a hard winter, for one flower to open on the mind's tree of thorns. Oh, he is the true poet, isn't he? He thinks in metaphors. I mean, metaphors. I mean, I met Seamus Heaney on more than one occasion. A lovely man, and he did the same thing. And I was sitting at a table in a Chinese restaurant, and he was trying to get over an idea, and he just came up with this metaphor. And anybody else, you'd go, oh, come on. But no. And when Lowell died, he said, it's as if the great top of poetry has come down. You know, just like that. That's how he saw it. And again here, harder for one flower to open on the mind's tree of thorns. The eloquence, in other words, not of words, but of silence. And I want to end with some lines from an untitled sonnet from R.S.'s somewhat neglected late collection, Counterpoint, published in 1990. The poet's silence waits to hear God's silence speaking, and we notice the imagery again, the bottomless ocean, the fathoms beneath. There's an echo of Psalm 42, where deep calleth unto deep. But the tone here is none of the anguish that we saw in those poems of Kierkegaardian struggle in the 70s. The opening lines are now engraved on a plaque in the porch of R S Thomas's former church at Eglisvar, which I find very pleasing. But the silence in the mind is when we live best, within listening distance of the silence we call God. This is the deep calling to deep of the psalm writer, the bottomless ocean we launch the armada of our thoughts on, never arriving. It is a presence then, whose margins are our margins, that calls us out over our own fathoms. What to do but draw a little nearer to such ubiquity by remaining still. Thank you very much. We'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, so very, very much. I'm conscious it is lunchtime and one or two of us may have plans for lunch, so I'm wondering if I could suggest, if anybody does have a quick question, maybe just to come up and chat to Tony about it, so we may not go public in the questions at this point. But if you're able to stay around for a few moments, if anybody wants an individual question or two, see you back for 2 o'clock, for our final session in this wonderful day. Thank you so much. Enjoy your lunch.
I will at some point be at the back with the picture poems, which for a small £5. Great, you can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go past that way because that's on.